Today, you are going to learn exactly what it takes to pass a technical interview. Now, in order to explain that to you, I brought one of my good friends, Kevin. Now, Kevin is an ex-Google, ex-Amazon software engineer. He worked over 8 years in the tech industry, and throughout his time there, he's given hundreds of technical interviews. He's also my partner inside of DevLaunch, where we have trained many engineers to pass these types of technical interviews, especially at large tech companies. Kevin knows the interview process in and out much better than I do, so I brought him onto the channel to explain it to you. We go over common pitfalls, we go over the recipe that you need to follow, what to do before, after, and during the interview, and I promise you in this video, you are going to learn a ton. Now, if you want to learn directly from Kevin and myself, as well as a bunch of other experienced software engineers, you can apply to DevLaunch by clicking the link down below. With that said, let's get into it. Kevin, thank you for sitting down with me here. I like to refer to you as the interviewing kind of expert, even though I know it's tough to be an expert at interviewing because you have just done far more than I have. So that's why I've brought you on the channel. And I want to ask you in this video, how the heck do you prepare and pass a technical interview? Sound good?
Sounds good. Let's do it.
Okay, so I have like a general structure. Feel free to go off of it because, again, you're the expert here. That's why you're on the channel. But let's start with preparation. Let's say, I'm a new grad. I don't have any of the experience I've had before, and I land an interview at Meta, and I get one at NVIDIA, or I get one at Google, etc. Right? We're talking big tech companies here. How the heck do I prepare for that?
I think the first thing you have to do is you have to educate yourself on what you're walking into. The most guaranteed way to fail is to walk into the interview having no idea what you're about to do. So become familiar with the process. All these different companies might have different processes or slightly different processes, although they generally follow sort of the same thing. You'll probably do a recruiter phone screen. If you do well on that or don't raise any red flags, you'll probably do a technical phone screen. And if you do well on that, you'll probably have a full loop that's on site, either virtual or at the campus. And you'll probably do like 4 or 5 interviews that whole day. So first thing is just know what you're walking into, know what you're getting into. The second thing is that everything you're going to do is actually about what you do now, between now and the actual interview. So if it's a leak code style thing, do problems every single day and make sure that you're learning all the different maybe 15 topics that are going to be tested during those technical interviews. And that's really what it comes down to. So in a very simple case, it's like you have to know the technical skills for how to solve these problems, and you need to know these different data structures and algorithms to apply to these problems. So if you do enough of them, you'll start learning the patterns. And really the biggest part about these interviews is these are massive opportunities. So don't take them lightly, prepare heavily, do problems every single day. And it really could be a life-changing offer that you land if you're willing to do that work.
Okay, perfect. Is there anything else you think that I should do? Like, should I, for example, look up like the company mission statement? Should I go like research on Reddit for 10 hours and see the problems that have been asked before? Is there any like little tricks like that maybe?
Yeah, so luckily it's not really a science. And what I love about that is it's not like gaming the system per se, but really what you could do is like LeetCode has a frequency sorter. So you could see like, oh, these are the most common questions asked by NVIDIA right now. Obviously, all these companies are not supposed to ask any questions that are leaked. And that's something that you're told at all these different companies, but still some, people might ask them or they might not know a question's leaked, but you should do your due diligence, right? You shouldn't walk into a Meta interview, get the most frequently asked question on LeetCode from Meta, and then not know how to solve that problem, right? That would be really silly. So know what you're getting into and make sure that you do your due diligence there. But for better or worse, there's not really a secret recipe. It's just making sure that you allocate enough time to learn these different topics and concepts. And while that sounds really dry and boring, I think it should actually be exciting to you because there's no secret sauce really. Like what stands between you and getting an offer or doing well in these interviews is just doing enough work and learning all these different topics, not memorizing.
For sure. Okay, I think that's probably a relief to a lot of people to hear that. And I mean, that reminds me of when I was doing my interviews back in the day. I didn't have some like crazy science to what I was doing. I generally was just like, I want to be really comfortable being able to answer any type of question. And that means I kind of need to know the core patterns. I need to obviously know how to code and be fluent and have the syntax down. I need to have practice, communicating my thought process. And we can get into that now. So, okay, we've done a little bit of prep. We've got the LeetCode out of the way. Let's say I'm walking in now to my on-site interviews. And let's imagine we fast forward to the point where I actually get asked a technical question, reverse a links list, something along those lines. Mm-hmm. What do I do now? Is there some kind of formula to follow? Do I just like start coding right away? What does that look like?
Yeah. So the funny thing here is like, the good news is it should just be doing what you already know how to do, right? If you've put in enough work and you've gone through all these different problems, you probably feel right at home with whatever question you've been asked, or at least that's hopefully how you feel. But what I recommend to people is that you want interviews to be very much like a recipe. You can imagine that if you've baked a cake once, you probably need to look at the recipe, right? The pages aren't creased. You don't really know what you're doing. You have to double check how much sugar. But when you've done that recipe 100 different times, it becomes ingrained in your memory. And you really want interviews to become like a recipe. So you want to have a guaranteed set of steps, concrete steps, clear steps that metaphorically get you a cake by the end of it, right? You could bake a cake on your own during that interview. So you want to practice that recipe sort of beforehand. And that really boils down to like 7 or so different steps in my experience. And what I really think that comes down to is just first reading and understanding the problem. You can't solve a problem if you don't understand it. And it sounds silly, but we'll probably talk about this later. There was a time where I didn't understand what I was being asked and acted like I did. The second step is to ask clarifying questions. You're oftentimes not given all the information in a problem on purpose because building software is ambiguous. If I told you to go make a to-do list app, there might be things that I'm expecting you to do. And if you don't ask questions, you might not build the right thing. The third thing is to actually propose different solutions. If you could say, here's 3 ways to solve this problem, and option B is the best because A, B, and C, that looks really good. Once you could actually tell the interviewer how to solve the problem, then you basically want to write your solution, and that should be really easy. That should be the easiest part of the interview, ironically. If you know what you're doing, it should take you maybe 2 or 3 minutes to type out the solution. And then step 5 is really to rubber duck. Everybody makes mistakes. You want to make sure that if you've written a bunch of code, you didn't make any mistakes. And if you did, it's okay, but it looks better if you find the problems before the interviewer does. Step 6 is basically to ask, talk about any pitfalls or optimizations that you can make. And 7 really is to just talk about the runtime and the space complexity, because that's important, right? All the software runs at massive scales, and you want to make sure that you're not slowing down things unnecessarily. So follow a recipe. That's sort of the recipe that I like to follow, but you need to make sure that you have reproducible steps that are going to help you pass the interview.
Yeah, that's great. And what I love about the recipe, and this is exactly what I followed, not like the exact wording that you had, but very similar when I was doing my interviews, is that it gives you something to kind of crutch on where if you don't actually know exactly how to solve the problem or what to do, you can at least make progress because you just start at step 1 and then you go to step 2 and then you go to step 3. And even if you get stuck at a certain point, you're not just kind of guessing, because a lot of people, when I see in interviews, especially when we do mocks inside of DevLaunch and stuff, is that they just kind of like give up. They get asked the question and they don't really know what to do next. They haven't learned the recipe, for example, and they're just kind of in this space where nothing gets done. At least where if you have the recipe, you can get through the first few steps without needing to know the exact most optimal solution to the code. And you can make progress where you give yourself a chance. You can get some hints, like you can make some progress in the interview, where if you don't have that recipe, you're kind of just guessing. And, like we've said, it's very difficult to succeed if you don't know what you're about to do. It's hard enough to solve the problem. It's another level of complexity if you don't know how you're going to go about presenting that to the interviewer. Now, let's get into a few specifics. I mean, I'm familiar with tech interviews as well, but you really know a lot more than me. Is there a certain time allocation that I should have for some of these steps? So for example, like planning it and coming up with the solution versus coding. I know you said coding like 2 or 3 minutes, but what is like the optimal amount of time I should spend in these areas?
Yeah, so it's hard to break it down super succinctly, but generally speaking, I think a good rule of thumb is that you want to be writing code within the first 10 minutes. And what I think that does is it makes sure that you feel a certain amount of pressure to like read and understand the problem, to ask those clarifying questions, to figure out what a solution is to the problem, and then to start writing your code. So having that sort of time limit on yourself, I think, is just a good guidepost. And I also think that's really good too, because let's say a company expects you to only solve one problem during that allotted time. I think if you could start coding the solution to a problem within 10 minutes and it only takes you a couple minutes to solve the problem, right, or to write the solution to the problem, I think you're teeing yourself up to actually solve 2 questions during that interview. And I think that looks really good, right? Your goal shouldn't be to meet some company's bar. It should be to define a new bar. And so if you practice like that, right? If you practice, during this interview, I'm going to have 40 minutes to solve it. But if you do your practice like you only have 20 minutes, it's going to be way easier. You want your practice to emulate the real thing. And so while it's hard to put exact time bounds on these different things, I think a good rule of thumb is to try and be writing your code within the first 10 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's a good benchmark to aim for. How do companies evaluate your performance in the interview? Sure, we have the recipe we go through. We're going to do those things. Is there like a rubric that they have? Is there a certain like check boxes that they're looking for? I know you've given some of these interviews before. Can you give me some insight there?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it has to do with like making sure that you are checking certain boxes. Like, for example, one of the things we talked about is asking clarifying questions. Again, that's on purpose, right? It's expected that you're going to ask clarifying questions because that's what you do on the job, right? That's very similar to what you do when you gather requirements for a product or or when you're designing a system, like what it needs to support, what it shouldn't support, what's in scope, what's out of scope. So that's one of the things, for example, that we're looking at. But in general, yeah, there is a rubric. You want to make sure that someone's collaborative. You want to make sure that someone actually understands very deep technical things, right? Because you want to, at the core of it, everything is about being technically competent. And so if you're not, that's a problem. So a lot of it has to come down to checking those certain boxes. And I think the other thing that's a little bit more like underlying, that's not necessarily on a rubric, but like you can imagine that if someone's giving you a question, they might have given that question to 100 other candidates, right? And so it's not someone stack ranking you, but if someone else has solved that problem really, really efficiently or really, really well, you might be somehow compared to those people, even subconsciously, if that makes sense, right? If I've asked this question to 100 different people, I kind of have a good benchmark for like what is a good passing mark and what's maybe a failing mark, or how far I expect a candidate to get during this problem. So there's definitely a rubric or criteria that people look for and that companies tell interviewers to look for. And then I think there's a little bit of like a subconscious thing because an interviewer might have asked a question so many times.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think people will just do that naturally, even if, they're guided not to. I mean, I'm sure that's like, okay, don't compare them to the other people, do an independent evaluation. But at the end of the day, you're picking between different candidates. So of course, I mean, that's going to come up in your brain. Now, communication. Let's touch on that a little bit because obviously, this rubric that we've or not rubric, I guess formula recipe that we've shared aims so that you over communicate, but can you touch on how important that is in the interviews? Because I notice a lot of candidates, when I give them the mock interviews, they really don't kind of hit on that communication component. And they think that if they can just whip up, the fastest coded solution immediately, that they're going to pass the interview, when that's really only half the battle. But anyways, I want to hear from you. Like, what has your experience been with candidates communicating, not communicating? What is the importance there?
One of the biggest things to understand here is that people think that interviewers are this weird, scary thing where you're being judged 45 minutes in silence by an interviewer. But the reality is that this is the exact opposite of what a good interview should be. In my opinion, a good interview should be collaborative, right? And the way to do that as an interviewee is to make sure that when you're communicating, you're really bringing your interviewer with you every step of the way. You're making sure that you're walking in lockstep, right? They understand everything you're doing, why you're doing it, why you made a certain decision, what the trade-offs are. And so you really want to communicate in a way that is effective, obviously. I want the interviewer to understand what I'm saying. And then the other thing too, I think that people get nervous about, especially during these high pressure situations, is that they tend to ramble. So you want to make sure that when you are communicating, you're doing so succinctly and you're getting all the information that you need. But just remember, every single step in the interview should be you walking with your interviewer together. So one of the things, for example, that you can just do too is it's kind of a game, right? Part of the interview should be trying to make sure that you are getting as much help as possible without actually asking for help directly. So one of the best ways that I think to do this is like when I propose a solution during every single one of my interviews, I always ask the interviewer, how does that sound to you? Right? And by doing that, it's sort of riding this line between me saying, I actually don't think this will work, or I'm not sure if this will work. It's not saying that at all. And it's also not saying this is 100% guaranteed going to work. This is the best possible solution. I'm just sort of sitting on the fence and I'm saying, how does that sound to you, Tim? And that's a social cue that A, the person has to answer, and B, whether they want to or not, they're probably going to somehow guide me whether it's right or wrong, right? They're going to give me a green light, like that looks good, or that sounds good to me, Kevin. And then I know that's probably a social cue that that's a good solution. I could probably go forward. Or they might say something that's like a yellow light, and it might be something like, are you sure that is going to pass for this specific test case? And then I should think about, what am I missing here? Or it might be a red light, right? They might give me something completely different that's like, I'm not sure if that's going to work. Or maybe something a little bit less direct. But the way you communicate is also the way that you get help. And if you learn how to get help without actually saying like, oh, I have no idea if this is going to work, you have a better chance of passing the interview. And I think part of that has a lot to do with like being socially competent and understanding people's cues.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point there. Just like being friendly, not being awkward, and also realizing that it is a conversation. Ultimately, anytime I've given an interview, and probably similar with you, I want the person to succeed. Like when I bring someone in for an interview, I hope that they're going to be the best candidate that I've ever seen because I want the best candidate. I want to hire them. I'm not praying for their downfall or hoping that they fail this question. And I have no ego attached to them, blowing it out of the water. I hope that they do that. So the more that they allow me to give them that little bit of assistance without giving away the question, typically when I've done interviews, I like to do that because I'm rooting for that candidate. But you want to be on that side early on in the interview because you're communicating. Whereas if someone just sits there in complete silence, you kind of give up on them a little bit. You have no idea what they're thinking or doing, and you can't even really help them if you want to because you have no clue where they're going, right? And in my interview, I remember a very clear point where I had explained everything very well. I'm also used to doing this because I, do tech tutorials online where you kind of have to do that. And I got to a point where there's this kind of like complex part of the code. And I had explained exactly what I wanted to code. And the interviewer just told me, oh, don't worry, but you don't need to code that out. Just do like 3 dots. We know what you're going to do there because you explained it. Like, think about how beneficial that can be to you as a candidate, where you can just skip writing an entire function or code block because you explained it so well that the interviewer just believes that it's going to work and you just move on. Like, that's the situations that you want to be in, which you can only get into by communicating clearly. So I think that's, a great description there. Let's say, we followed Kevin's advice. Everything's going great. We've, finished the interview, the technical side of things at least. What should we do after the interview? Should we follow up with the person? Should we spam them a bunch of times? Is there like questions we should ask them? Like, let's say we're at the, the tail end where we did the technical part and now we're kind of rolling off, maybe moving into the next one. Is there anything there that we should think about from the technical interview side?
So are we saying that we're still in the interview, but we just finished the technical portion of it?
Yes, sorry. Yeah, it's a hard way for me to explain that. But yeah, you know what I mean?
Yeah. So what I really like to do, and again, a lot of this comes down to just being technically competent. For better or for worse, like if you want to be a software engineer, you have to know how to write code, efficient code that's, well maintained, that's documented, that people can change and update. So while I don't think there's tons that you could do the last 5 minutes of the interview that's going to really move the needle, right? A lot of the performance has already passed. What I do like to do is try and do things that make the interviewer think of me or think of me as like a unique candidate. So for example, like you kind of want to stand out in their brain. And I think one of the best ways to do that is just to ask like unique or meaningful questions. You have to remember that this is a two-way street, right? You want to know, as much as they want to know, should you work at this company? You want to know, do I want to work at this company? And I think you should ask questions that are actually of interest to you that will help you make a decision if you do end up getting an offer from this company for if you want to join. But I think you also want to ask questions that they probably don't hear all the time, right? So if someone asked you like, oh, what's your typical day like? That's fine to ask, but I don't think it's very unique. I've probably been asked that 100 different times from a million different people, right? And I think it's not very special, whereas if I asked something that was more informative, like if you go back and start from day one at Google, what's one thing you would tell yourself to become the best engineer possible? I think that's interesting. I think that they probably don't get that question a lot. And I think B, it's actually helpful for your own career, right? That's something that you can take and know if I join this company or maybe even another tangential company, that's probably a thing that I should listen to. This person might be a staff engineer interviewing me, and they told me that I should make sure that I ask questions to every single person within the first month of joining. And that could be really valuable advice even for your own career. So just try and ask questions that are unique, things that they don't hear all the time, and also things that are going to help you make a decision about joining the company or help you in your own career as well. Because these are valuable people to talk to. Like, remember that. These are good engineers.
Yeah, and you can learn a lot with the correct question, and people love to talk, especially about themselves. So if you ask them a really insightful question, then they're going to be engaged and they're going to want to give you a good answer. So that's a great point. Now, let's get into a few like kind of more rapid fire like questions to some extent here. Is there one particular trait that you notice across the candidates that are successful in these interviews? Can you, for example, in like 5 or 10 minutes when someone comes into the interview, can you tell if they're going to be a good candidate or not, like right away?
I think you could definitely tell if someone knows what they're doing. And I think really the trait it comes down to is being a technically competent engineer, right? For better or for worse, that is what it comes down to. I'm going to give you a problem. Can you solve the problem? There's no way to really beat around the bush with that, right? The ideal scenario is that you solve the problem. So to me, it's someone who's just very technically competent. And again, the good news is that you decide those things well before the interview, right? If you've been doing all your homework, if you've been doing all the problems, if you've been reading up on stuff that you should know about computers, that's really what determines this. And so I don't like when people think, oh my gosh, this is a 45-minute interview that feels like I'm playing in the Super Bowl. That's just not the way to treat it. Everything that you do beforehand is what actually influences what happens during those 45 minutes. And the best news is that you can decide how those 45 minutes are going to go by all the prep that you can choose to do. So it really comes down to being technically competent. And I don't think that should be a surprise to anyone.
For sure. And I think that's empowering to the people who are technically competent, who feel like, it's this whole mysterious game where in reality, like you said, it is that prep that leads up to it. And even you and me, right now we're not grinding leak code questions. If we do a little bit of prep, we can walk into a tech interview and comfortably pass one because you are just technically competent, right? And it takes away a lot of the nerves when you actually have those skills, which, yeah, you shouldn't be surprised you need to land, a $500,000 job at Google, just exaggerating, but you get the idea. Now, any common mistakes, like quite common things that people do that either instantly eliminates them or really just looks poorly in the interview?
To me, what I tend to see is people are nervous. And so I think the best way to get over that is by putting yourself in that position as much as possible. So the best way to do that is by doing other interviews. So part of it is a numbers game, right? You just have to get the reps in. And eventually, if you've done 100 interviews, you're not going to feel as nervous as your first interview. There's just no way. And if you somehow still do, okay, maybe you need to do 200 interviews. That's just the reality of it. So practice how you play, put yourself in that position where hopefully you're not going to be nervous. You could also do mock interviews with people, but it doesn't as, closely emulate the real thing. I think the other thing that I see people that just gets in their own way is that they don't ask clarifying questions. You have to remember, right? There's a recipe for a reason, because if you skip step 2 of putting flour in the cake, you're not going to get a cake. It's the same thing with interviews. If you don't ask clarifying questions, there's no possible way. If you're missing 30% of the information, any solution you put forward is not guaranteed to work, right? It might fail a certain edge case or many of the test cases where you might not know that the list of numbers can contain negative numbers, and now all of a sudden your solution doesn't work at all. So a lot of people sort of, don't do right by themselves by failing to ask clarifying questions. So you really need to make sure that you do that. So get your nerves under control and definitely make sure that you get all the information before you try and solve the problem or propose a solution.
For sure. Being just calm, cool, talking like a normal human being. I mean, that's only going to do you, good things, right, advantages in the interview. And it's funny because when I've walked into interviews, I do just treat them like a conversation. And I notice that they're just so much more relaxing. They're actually fun in some cases if it's a good problem and you're working with the right person and you can build rapport, and it's not this really, intimidating, aggressive thing. But obviously it takes a bit of experience to get to that point. But that's what the best engineers do, right? The expert, principal, senior engineers, they don't walk into interviews nervous. They just walk in, okay, is this company one I want to work for? All right, let me demonstrate my skills, and then get the offer, right? And that's the best people in the industry. Not easy to do right now at a junior level, but you can get there, and that's what you need to strive for. That was super helpful, Kevin. That was a lot of information. Hopefully everyone watching this has consumed some of that and got some valuable data there. Any last tips, pointers, advice, motivation you want to share with people before we end the video?
I think just really, truly, you can do it. The only thing that stands between you and getting an offer is putting in enough reps, sending out enough applications, and sharpening your skills, getting to the point where you can walk into an interview and pass. So don't think it's impossible. Don't think that because the market's bad, you can't get a job. It really comes down to you doing the things that you need to do to get to that place. You shouldn't feel like you can or can't get a job because of extenuating or outside circumstances. You can absolutely do it. If I can do it, you could do it. Anyone could do it. Just make sure you put in the work and put in the reps, and you can absolutely get there. It's just a function of time.
Ultimately, it's in your control, right? And there's
Correct.
A lot of variables that you can control. And while we like to complain about the ones we can't, the people that get the jobs, they take it into their own hands. Now, look, Kevin is my business partner inside of DevLaunch. We started this up about 6-7 months ago. We've been very successful helping developers like you watching this video land jobs. If you already know how to code and you're struggling with things like getting interviews, passing those technical interviews, and you want to work with someone like Kevin, who has literally given hundreds of interviews throughout his career, mock and real, then consider applying for the program. You can book a call from the link in the description, and I look forward to seeing you there. Thanks everyone for watching. See you in the next one.